Good morning. My name is Jenny Lang, and I serve as the Director of Workforce Development, Diversity, and Inclusion for Ascension, Texas. And I'm excited to be here, and I'm excited to welcome you to our discussion about LGBTQIA plus quality of life in the greater Austin area. According to Equality Texas, the population of LGBTQIA plus Texans reached 930,000 in 2019. Despite increasing visibility, we know this community still faces many barriers, and our seasoned panel will be addressing some of these this morning. At Ascension, Texas, we commit ourselves to serving all persons with special attention to those who are most vulnerable. We are advocates for a compassionate and just society through our actions and through our words. This includes raising awareness and advocating for the health equity for our LGBTQIA plus community. According to the Trevor Project, a leading national organization providing intervention and suicide prevention services, 71% of LGBTQIA plus youth reported feeling sad or hopeless for at least 2 weeks in the past year. 39% of LGBTQIA plus youth seriously considered attempting suicide in the past 12 months, with more than half of transgender and non-binary youth having seriously considered. At Dell Children's Medical Center, we are working to build resilience in our LGBTQIA plus youth and ensure these patients and their families have the best resources available. Our adolescent clinic offers medical treatment of gender non-conforming, gender diverse, and transgender children and adolescents. Additionally, youth who are struggling can now visit the Grace Grego Maxwell Mental Health Unit at Dell Children's. Last year, Ascension launched a new justice-focused framework called ABIDE, or rather appreciation, belongingness, inclusivity, diversity, and equity. Through ABIDE, we acknowledge and celebrate the inherent dignity of each and every person while fostering a more inclusive culture and community. With this type of engagement, Ascension, Texas, which includes Ascension Seton and Dell Children's, continues to close the gap in health disparities across Central Texas. Lastly, I'd love to offer another key takeaway from the Trevor Project's work. 98% of LGBTQIA plus youth said a safe space for social networking, communication, and connection would be valuable to them. With that spirit in mind, please join me as we hear our panelists reflect upon the state of our LGBTQIA plus community in the greater Austin area and actionable steps to improve the quality of life.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Courtney Bailey, Director of Issues and Engagement at Leadership Boston. And I want to thank Jenny Lang, Director of Workforce Development, Diversity, and Inclusion at Ascension Seton, for helping to set the stage for today's conversation. And thank each of you for joining us to discuss this month's engaged topic on LGBTQIA plus quality of life. And as you may know, I'm co-hosting this panel with journalist Judy Maggio.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for sharing part of your day with us. We thank you for being here. We have a quick reminder for those of you watching on Facebook. We want you to engage with our panel and ask questions. So please, if you have some questions for them, just write them in the comments section, and Courtney and I will do our best to get to your question.
Now, before I introduce our panelists, I want to define the term LGBTQIA+, which you will hear Judy and I use throughout this conversation. LGBTQIA stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer or questioning, intersex, and asexual. The plus symbol is intended to represent all of the other sexes, sexual orientations, and gender identities that are not included in the acronym. So now, let me introduce you to the amazing individuals who make up this panel. First, we have Queen Austin, founder of the Austin Queer Cultural Center. Next, we have Avez Azar, teaching assistant and PhD candidate at the University of Texas at Austin School of Architecture. And we have Sarah Kapostashi, clinical and social service director of Out Youth and Transgender Wellness.
We also want to take time this morning to acknowledge Ricardo Martinez. Ricardo is the CEO of Equality Texas. He was planning on being part of our panel this morning, but he had to bow out due to the demands of his work at the Texas Capitol today. Equality Texas, as you know, and other advocates are speaking out against several bills under consideration at the Capitol. Ricardo sends his apologies, and I want to send along a quote as well from him. He says, "I must prioritize my time to help preserve the humanity of trans folks and the rights of LGBTQIA plus people." We certainly understand Ricardo, and we want to welcome our panelists and thank them so much for sharing their perspective with all of us today.
So to kick off the conversation, I would like take a moment to have each of you weigh in on the following questions. So we know there are a lot of misconceptions when it comes to LGBTQIA neighbors, and I want to ask you to share one misconception that you would like to address in this moment. And I'll start with Queen Austin.
Yes, hello, good morning, everyone. One misconception about the LGBT plus community is misgendering and misgendering. Just because a person, you know, a human being looks like, let's say, for instance, a male and is sounding like a male, look like a male, she doesn't feel that way about herself. As you see, I corrected myself right there. That is the one big misconception about the LGBT community. And as well as just getting to know someone, getting to know who they identify themselves as a little bit more than just on the eye. So I just want people out there to know that getting to know someone, especially a part of the LGBT plus community, is very important than just looks and what other people's conceptions are on that particular person.
Before I go on to the next speaker, Queen, can I do a follow-up with you? What can we do to prevent misgendering?
Like I said, getting to know a person, asking them their name, their proper pronouns. I learned that being here from Austin, a lot of people are moving here because it's like a sense of urgency, of freedom. They're able to express who they are. Austin has been coined the weird city. So the way is, it's not weird, but in a way here you're accepted. So if we're gonna be contributing to Austin in any way, we need to be able to accept that culture here and embrace that culture.
So build those relationships. Sarah?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. So very glad to be here. And I will say one misconception is that our community as a whole is a monolith. We're not. We're a very diverse group of people under this LGBTQIA umbrella. And one thing I want to note is, as a cisgender, white, middle-class woman who's often perceived as heterosexual, I'm not, but I'm perceived that way, kind of to Queen's point, like people make a lot of assumptions, right? But I move through the world in a very different way than some other people in my community because of the privilege that comes along with a lot of my particular identities. So just because you know me, you're friends with me, you talk to me, doesn't mean that you know what it's like to be part of this community in Austin. And, you know, even if you know me and talk to me, doesn't mean you understand every, you know, white, middle-class, queer woman, because there's a lot of other things that define me as a person beyond my gender identity and my sexual orientation. So I think, to Queen's point, really getting to know people and not making assumptions would be something I would recommend as you try to be friendly and affirming to folks in our larger community.
Thank you, Sarah. Yvette?
Again, thank you all so much for hosting us and for putting this great conversation together. And I think, you know, just building on the comments that have been made, I think one thing I would highlight is what's called the myth of gay affluence. There's this belief that gay folks are richer, higher income, and so don't face a lot of the economic and other kinds of pressures that people in our society face. But I just want to say that that's a myth, right? We know that actually queer folks are more likely to be homeless, more likely to be job precarity, more likely to actually have issues with discrimination in housing and growing up. Educational disparities are great, health disparities are great. So essentially to say that there is this belief that queer people are richer or somehow don't have to face a lot of the societal pressures that other groups do, but they do, and in some cases the disparities are greater. And it's important to, again, not assume that the entire community is a monolith, but really focus on the individual experiences of the folks and how they intersect with their other identities.
Aves, we had to debunk some of those myths this morning. I want to point out that we live in the state, Texas, that still doesn't offer legal protection for people who are LGBTQIA+ in employment, in housing, public accommodations, but Austin is widely considered kind of a safe haven. What do each of you think Austin's getting right when it comes to LGBTQIA in our community here? And what can the city do to better serve the needs of this community? Sarah, let's start with you on this one.
Sure. So I'll start by saying, I will say quite frankly that I think sometimes Austin as a city believes its own hype a little bit more than it needs to. And so I remember talking with a friend of mine, a Black trans woman, about the quality of medical care, particularly for the trans community in Austin. And this was several years ago. But she said to me, very frankly, Houston's doing it better. Dallas is doing it better. San Antonio is doing it better. So believing your own hype in Austin is not helping our community get the healthcare that we need. And I will say one thing that's promising to me is I think over the past several years that quality of care has improved in some aspects, but that's definitely an area where our medical system and our mental health care system needs to continue to work to be more culturally competent and affirming of our population.
Queen, would you agree that Austin doesn't always live up to what we bill ourselves as this welcoming, progressive city? What do you think we need to work on to better support the LGBTQI+ community?
Most definitely, original Austinite, born and raised here. I didn't know a lot about what was service to my community until I moved away from Austin. I've been physically back in Austin for 3 years. And I remember at a time being here in Austin, I was homeless and there was no place for me to go. So last year I led the LGBT plus Black Lives March for Solidarity to the Capitol, and I spoke with the Austin Chronicle in an interview, and I said that usually the LGBT comes together in a sense of Pride Month. I had urged them, if we keep applying the same energy as we do that one particular month and apply it all 12 months, and the next year so we'll all be in a much better place. Austin needs the motivation. It needs its motivation. It's like, it needs motivation. It's the only thing I can say. And with that, applying that same energy, I have been appointed on the Board of Commissions of Public Safety Task Force. So I'm making my initiative action by putting my foot through that door, going to those meetings, speaking up for us, because like I said, we don't have no motivation. I have had no motivation because I have not seen someone before me, like me, in that position, applying pressure to make change. But also needs motivation, I'm gonna be honest.
We want honesty this morning. Aves, how do you see Austin, the good, the bad, the ugly?
Sure. So, I would agree with what both Sarah and Queen said. We talk a lot about how we're doing good, and we're a more inclusive community than some other parts of Texas. Having said that, I think, we still have a lot of disparities around housing, around health, around access to public transportation. I know that always comes up as an issue. And I think one thing I also want to say is we also really lack cultural facilities for queer folks in this city. So if you're too young to go to a bar, and if you would choose not to go to a bar, or your health requires that you not go to a bar, there's not really much cultural spaces for queer folks to gather, right? Outside of that Pride Month, where we do a bunch of things where people bring together. And I think, I appreciate the work that Out Youth is doing, and Outpost is doing, and Queen is doing, really like creating those cultural spaces for folks to come together. Like, what does it mean to have a community center for queer folks in Austin? And that's missing.
I appreciate you pointing that out, Aves. Like, what does it mean to have a community center? Yeah, and I want to follow up with that with a question to Queen. Queen, as a Black trans woman, what does a safe, healthy, and inclusive Austin look like to you? And what steps can people at all levels of the city take to empower and protect our Black, trans, and non-binary neighbors?
Okay. Register that. What it means to actually have a community here, a community center. Other cities, other major big cities have that, like as we stated, Dallas, Houston, San Francisco, LA. Why not Austin? We're the greatest city in the world, right? And so I realized that, I have to take, like I said, take foot in City Hall. If I have to be the only one in that room that's Black transgender woman in that room speaking up for this whole umbrella, as we say, of the LGBT plus, I will do it, because we don't have that here. It is very important because there's homeless people out here. There's the rate of trans murders is going up, and God forbid, thank God, we haven't had any here in Austin, but what can we do to prevent that? What can we do to get these lives, the proper medication, the proper psychiatrists, everything, mental health, all these things? What can we do other than just filling out survey forms? I'm just going to be honest here. So just taking initiative action. Let's start. I started a Venmo to start funding for the Austin Queer Culture Center. You say, what can Austin do? Reach out to those individuals, donate to those organizations, build those organizations just as it needs to be, because it has to start somewhere. It falls back into motivation. I'm going to need a lot of motivation. We're going to need a lot of motivation in this community. Saying and then doing are two different things, and we all know that.
Absolutely. I want to shift the focus now to young people, and everybody is welcome to chime in, but Sarah, I'm going to direct this to you because I know that a lot of your work does involve the young people. A 2019 report by the Texas Pride Impact Fund showed nearly 80% of responding organizations that serve LGBTQIA people in Central Texas reported they don't provide school and youth outreach programs. What are some of the unique social and emotional health needs of the LGBTQIA+ young people? And are there some ways we can bridge these gaps? What can these organizations do to reach out and meet the needs of these folks, Sarah?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, as an organization that does work with young people, with adolescents, I will say it's incredibly fun and rewarding. It's also pretty challenging. And I think one myth that we like to dispel as we have these conversations in the community is there's this perception for some reason that it's easier to come out or to be an LGBTQIA+ young person today. And what we like to say is it's definitely not easier. It's just a little bit different, because the same factors of minority stress caused by transphobia and homophobia and rejection and bullying are just as present today as they always have been. And that can lead to some of the mental health disparities that our friend from Ascension shared, that data from the Trevor Project, that data that's been replicated over and over again about how, mental health disparities are a real thing for LGBTQIA youth. That's all there and very real. So what I would say is some of the specific challenges that those young people face sometimes is you're trying to accomplish all the developmental tasks of adolescence, identity formation, becoming more independent, finding a peer group. You're trying to do all of that while also sorting out feelings related to sexuality and gender identity. And so that can be incredibly challenging, especially if you experience things like bullying and family rejection. So what I would say to other organizations or other people doing this work is don't be afraid to work with young people. I think particularly with the specifics of mental health and mental health counseling, there's a lot of fear related to parental consent, which is real. So this idea that in order for a young person to seek out individual therapy, if they're under the age of 18 in Texas, a parent needs to sign off on that. But what if the youth doesn't want to come out, or it's not safe to come out, or they're not safe to ask for that parental consent? That can be a real challenge. So I think also being really committed to talking with families and caregivers, addressing those parents and guardians when they're, trying to get support and having concerns, I think is also a really important step that people can take. And then finally, I think working with larger systems. So school districts in particular, so working with those systems so that they can become more affirming, and then also other youth serving organizations, because the data also shows us that there's a lot of LGBTQIA youth around. And so they're also showing up in non-specific LGBT programs. So making sure those folks really know how to approach working with those kiddos is also pretty important.
Great suggestions.
Thank you. I want to reiterate that don't be afraid to work with young people who identify as LGBTQIA+, and meet them where they are. Thank you for saying that, Sarah. I'm going to switch gears real quick with my question to you, Yves. You mentioned this earlier, so I want to go back to it. So despite popular stereotypes about wealth and extravagance, many LGBTQIA+ Texans are at high risk of being either housing insecure or unhoused. The Texas Pride Impact Fund report found that more than half of LGBTQIA+ identifying respondents under the age of 30 had recently experienced homelessness. So Yves, what is the state of housing for our LGBTQIA+ neighbors in Greater Austin, and what practices should be implemented to improve housing equity and accessibility?
I'll start off by sort of reiterating those numbers, and they're so specific. So even in the city of Austin, the data that we have shows us that 23% of homeless youth identify as LGBTQIA, whereas only 7% in the general population do, right? So we're talking about a threefold number of homeless youth who identify as LGBTQIA. And then in our fair housing study, we did find that a lot of LGBTQ folks talked about housing discrimination and abuse from landlords, but they were also afraid of things like high rent and being priced out and gentrification and the impacts that they have. And they were very clear on saying, that a lot of this is coming from the fact that, LGBTQ folks may have a tendency to be renters and low income. And so they're more likely to face this sort of pressure in the housing market that a lot of other folks are facing too. And I think in terms of like, what can we do to do better? I think one is really, work with the city and the landlords to figure out what is the way to have non-discriminatory housing policies. Currently, we do have policies on the ground that say that you cannot discriminate in housing, but they don't always play out the same way. Folks might not realize them, or we need better compliance to make sure that people are complying with that, and their non-discrimination is an actual value that we have as a city. The other thing I want to mention is also to create affirming housing situations, right? Whether it's shelters that are affirming for LGBTQI folks, whether it's senior affirming housing, right? So Houston's building housing for LGBTQ seniors, that's going to be affirming. We don't have anything like that, even though we know that, the need for senior housing in this population group is big. So essentially, I guess we need to work harder and move forward in a way that really focuses on affirming housing for this population.
Thank you for saying that, creating affirming housing.
I wanted to add something or take a deeper dive on something that you said, Yves. I think that sometimes older people who are LGBTQIA+ are often forgotten. I know Meals on Wheels last year before the pandemic opened up the first site for gathering for older folks who are LGBTQIA+ that can just have a place to gather for lunch, once a week. Are we seeing any progress in that area? Because I think sometimes folks who are older are more apt to not talk openly about their sexuality.
I think we're definitely, we have great advocates in our community who are working on LGBTQ senior issues. And I think they're pushing the envelope, pushing us harder. And yet there's a long way to go, right? Like you're saying, creating a pop-up space for folks to come together, but really what kind of space can we provide them? What kind of affirming housing can we provide them? And I really just want to go back to right, like, what does that look like? What does that mean? And we know, for example, it's not in Austin, but another city, in a senior home, there were some LGBTQIA identifying seniors who wanted to do drag nights, and the home let them do it. They were essentially like, you cannot do this. This is not allowed in our space. And what does it mean to grow, in a space where you were discriminated against? And as you're aging, you cannot live your true self. So really making sure that we have specific affirming spaces, whether they're, social, whether they're, for housing or for other needs, that we provide those to our seniors, particularly in their sort of like waning rainbow years, to really enjoy and, live up to who they are.
Thanks.
Sarah, Queen, would you like to add to that?
Let's see. Like again, our community, our trans community, and such the youth as well. A large population is unemployed. So when you're unemployed, it's hard to get housing. It's hard to actually get a job. I'm gonna be honest. So I say for the ones that's watching, for the ones that's in higher places, the ones that rub elbows with politicians and councilmen and stuff like that, get on them to hire more of the LGBT community, put us more at forefront, because we can only change if we're allowed to change. Like, we're allowed to be ourselves, but our community as well needs to be able to adapt and embrace our culture. I don't like to call it an LGBT umbrella. It's our culture, and we have to protect it. My mom liked to say from 8 to 80. I like to say as in years. So from growing to old, you should be able to be allowed who you are, just as the next counterpart has, So with my vision with Austin Queer Culture Center, I'd be able to house, shelter, cook, prepare meals for our community, young, 8 to 80, just for saying, because we need that. We need it for our soul. We need it for our culture. But yeah, I just want to input on that because it's really important to the elders and for the ones that's underneath us, the youth. So what we do now, how we can change and affect, really would make tomorrow a better day. And it's bizarre that we have these conversations because it should have been things in forefront places for us. The organizations are wonderful. The data work is great. Now that we have that data work, now that they have that data work, it's time to put boots on ground, break ground, and build. Let's build from here.
Yeah, and just to build on that really quickly, both all of these wonderful comments, I kind of think of it as a both and situation. I absolutely think Austin needs more specific spaces for folks through various parts and identities and age groups within the LGBT community, absolutely. And I think it's really important to think about other spaces that people frequent, those becoming more affirming as well. So for example, I'm a part of a religious community that has a lot of multi-generational diversity. And we do have a fellowship specifically for the LGBTQIA community. And so really wanting to have this idea of we want to have separate and really safe, affirming spaces that are all of our own, yes, and trying to think about, are there existing social and community spaces that can also be pushed to be more affirming, where people are already comfortable in one sense and can just more fully express who they already are.
Thank you for that. I want to keep on this theme of affirming, and I'm going to switch to healthcare. So healthcare is a big topic, especially relevant given the recent bill seeking to ban gender-affirming care for trans youth in Arkansas and here in Texas. And so I want to be clear that there is a distinct difference between culturally responsive and friendly healthcare. So some doctors are simply kind and somewhat non-discriminatory, whereas others have the training, knowledge, and understanding, as well as expertise to address LGBTQIA+ specific medical issues. How can we strengthen the pipeline of providers who are knowledgeable about and responsive to the needs of LGBTQIA+ community members? And I will go with Yvette if you would like to start.
Sure. I think you're completely right that it has to be something beyond simply being, friendly towards folks. It's a very different conversation when we're talking about providing actual gender affirming care, which is about understanding the specific needs that folks have, understanding what specific issues that they might face, also understanding that they're going to need specific kind of care depending on their gender identity and their sexual orientation, and providing that care in a manner that is truly non-discriminatory, right? There's a lot of conversation on sexual health, but there's a lot of work that needs to be done in the space of mental health as well, which we're lacking. We know that where folks around the state, around the country, around the world are facing a lot of mental health pressure, but they do not often find the care where somebody can work with them in a way that is truly supportive of who they are without sort of adding in other pieces of ways of thinking that might harm them in the long term. And I do want to take, a second to really talk about the bills of the legislature. We're talking about really robbing trans youth of not just gender affirming care, but also ensuring that they don't, get the transition help that they need, and they don't get other kinds of mental health and other issues that they do not need. This goes against any medical practice, anything that parents have asked for, anything educators have asked for. So essentially at this point, we're creating anti-science, anti-parent, private sector bills and policy that harms our youth, right? As we're talking about, mental health and we're talking about suicide, we're creating situations where we're going to push our kids into harm's way. And so really it is up to all of us to really step up and say that this is not the kind of care that our youth in Texas deserve.
Queen or Sarah, would you like to add?
I'll just say I couldn't agree more in terms of the absolute chilling effect that a lot of these anti-LGBTQ, specifically anti-trans bills that are working their way through the legislature right now. And I'm really happy that a lot of groups like Equality Texas and the Transgender Education Network of Texas are at the Capitol as we speak, really rallying people to testify against these bills. Because unfortunately, the tough truth is we absolutely want to make sure these bills do not become law, but just the fact that we're talking about them has, like I said, a chilling effect. They've done a lot of research on the fact that in California, for example, when Prop 8, the anti-marriage equality ban was being discussed, that actually had a detrimental effect on LGBTQ youth mental health, because it was in the public discourse, because they were debating people's rights and their right to exist and live freely as they would like to. So it's already having a really detrimental effect. And I will say, like a lot of parents that we work with around encouraging what every medical association, every bit of research, every piece of science says is the proper way to address and care for trans youth. A lot of times they're struggling with that as a personal and family decision, and eventually they can get there. However, having this type of legislation even talked about may cause them to take a step back and actually not make that choice in consultation with a trained medical professional who really knows these issues backwards and forwards. So I want to say that. And then really briefly on the wonderful mental health point that was made, I think just access to mental health care in general is pretty abysmal. Because we have tied the ability to get mental health care to being able to be financially prosperous and stable, and also potentially having insurance, which is employment-based. And so Out Youth offers free and low-cost counseling, but we frequently have a 3-month wait list for our services. And there's just not a lot of resources out there in order to provide that excellent care. And the last thing I'll say in terms of a pipeline for affirming physicians and folks in the medical field, I think it really starts at the medical school level. So I'm glad to know that here in Austin at the new Dell Medical School, they do have several faculty in place who are doing this work actively in the community and are training a new generation of doctors to have awareness of this issue.
That was very encouraging to hear Jenny at the beginning talk about how they're training doctors to address these needs and be more aware and alert and compassionate about individuals and their needs. I want to drill down on public safety now. Queen mentioned it just a little bit, but this is a huge issue closely connected to LGBTQIA quality of life. Even though we've talked about this, Austin's considered a tolerant community, there are many people who still regularly face microaggressions, harassment, hate crimes. In 2019, Austin started a network of safe places for LGBTQIA plus victims of violence. But what else can we do to strengthen public safety? And how can we center LGBTQIA plus voices in those discussions? Queen, I'm going to start with you because I know you've been involved in this area.
Yes. I stated before, like I said, creating these spaces for us and these board meetings. I haven't originally joined in official board meeting, but on the public safety task force, but I know that I have a mouthful to say, and I'm going to be looking for that change that we need. I feel that I can express and speak about the situation because I have lived it. One thing is having a room full of people who does not experience and walk in those particular shoes. I have, and just to see, you know, me, I know for me in that position, the youth can have the motivation to get to that place to make a change for themselves as well. I lost my thought, I'm sorry, but it's important. It's very important for we all to know that like a lot of these people in the community are homeless or coming from jail or been in and out of jail, and they are afraid of police officers, okay? And a lot of that has to trickle down into the LGBT community. You have officers misgendering. I have been profiled misgendered by the Austin Police Department. So I'm just like over it. How can I fix it? How can I bring more to my community for me to make it better? But yeah.
And Sarah and Yves, I'd love to hear if you have any other comments about ways we can really strengthen public safety. And I think it's so important to get people who have lived experience in on those conversations with the public safety officers.
Go ahead, Sarah, and I'll jump in.
Thanks. We're working on a project right now at our agency, which I'm pretty passionate about just because I've walked a lot of families and youth and adults through the particular process of mental health crisis intervention. And so what I would really like to advocate for, and we've done some of this work already at the city, at the LGBTQ Quality of Life Commission, for example, is getting mental health deputies out of the process of mental health crisis intervention because of a lot of the things Queen noted in terms of a very real history, in terms of racist discrimination and also discrimination against our LGBT community as a whole. And so if somebody, for example, is experiencing a mental health crisis and calls a local mental health hotline, a lot of times the first person that's going to be dispatched, sometimes it is a beat cop who is in, a full uniform, police uniform. And then there are these mental health deputies that do receive a little training on crisis intervention, who then come next in order to work with the person who is in crisis. And in our experience, in my experience, a lot of times somebody in mental health crisis, seeing that uniform or seeing an institution that they don't necessarily trust is not going to make things better. So what we really want to advocate for is to have teams, and there's already models for this all around the country. We have a basis for this model in Austin, teams of social workers, of psychiatric nurse practitioners, of folks who are trained especially to encounter somebody in mental health crisis to get them the help that they need. And so that's one particular aspect of public safety that, as I talk to people around the community, even if they have really different points of view about reimagining public safety, a lot of people are really on board with this idea of taking this specific aspect off of the shoulders of police departments and putting it on more appropriate professionals to address crisis.
And as you said, it's been very successful in many other communities. Avest, do you want to weigh in on this one too?
Sure. I just want to add a little bit to the conversation that's honestly already happened and just reiterate, right? Like when we talk about public safety, I think one thing I really want to clarify is public safety is not the same as policing. These are different conversations. So I know a lot of times folks think, oh, well, if we retrain our police force, or if we add more security to like something like Pride, we're somehow going to create a safer space. And I just want to say that's not the conversation we want to have. Public safety is different from policing. They're not the same things. And as the city of Austin, we're reimagining public safety right now. And I know this is a big part of the conversation of making those spaces more safe for queer folks. And it has to be a different conversation than simply relying on old models like Sarah's saying, right? Like making sure that the first person to respond is not necessarily the person who might not be trained for that situation. That goes across the board in how we provide those services to folks. The other thing I just want to point out is it has to be a cultural shift. This is, our institutions need to change, and there's no doubt about that. There has to be a cultural shift. And I'm thinking about bystander intervention in occurrences where there is an issue and somebody's being harassed or targeted or there's a hate crime. It is really up to our allies as well as us, all of us, to stand up and be that person who intervenes in a safe way and de-escalates the situation. And so really, I would say if you're an ally, be there for the queer community when you see that they're in trouble.
Allies,
thank you.
Yep.
I just want to reiterate what you said. You said public safety is not the same as policing. I think that's important to reiterate that. And I also want to point out a comment. Shane stated that tolerance is not enough. And so we need to know that just being tolerant, that's not enough for the well-being of our LGBTQIA+ community. And also, Queen, I want to affirm you in for a moment. And I heard you when you said that like you're over it and you're tired. We appreciate you being on that commission. We need your voice. We need your lived experience. And so thank you for being here, and let us lift you as much as we can. So I just wanted to affirm you on that before I go to the audience question. We have a question from Justin Brady Joyner. Justin says, love the value in culturally competent medical care. Is there a list of medical professionals who practice this in Austin? Like, is there a resource list that, like, I know you all have listed outuse and outposts, but where can people go? Or is that lacking?
I did post a link in the chat. So our program does maintain various resource guides, and our biggest and most popular resource guide is our Transgender Wellness Resource Guide. And we do have an entire section for medical professionals, specifically folks who do provide gender affirming care in terms of hormone replacement therapy or surgery in the community, but also other providers with different specialties who the community has come to us and said, this person, this OBGYN was fantastic and really affirmed me as a trans man during my appointment. I will say that's one big piece that is lacking from what I've heard, from community and in my own experience, is specialists often really struggle with providing culturally competent care to the LGBTQIA community. The other resource I'll mention really briefly is there's a national resource called Rad Remedy, and it's created by the trans community for the trans community to find affirming providers in different communities throughout the United States. So those are our two resources I would reference.
Thank you. Vez or Queen, are there any other resources that you would like to include for people to seek out?
I think I'm going to say, the list Sarah has shared, I know Out Youth has a really good resource. I would definitely go there. It's pretty comprehensive. I think two places I just want to highlight, and they're in the list as well. One is the Kind Clinic, which I think has really been doing great work in our community, and also the David Powell Clinic is doing a great job. And I want to say, Integral Care and other folks are really also beginning to work on this. But I just really wanted to highlight those two specific projects and the work that they're doing because it's great.
Thank you.
Yes, and I think as well, a new organization is called Embrace and Ashwell. Embrace Austin and Ashwell can also lead and help you with any other questions.
And then in terms of leadership,
Go
ahead.
ahead.
Thank you. See that Zoom, the etiquette. And I also want to plug the Austin, Black Trans Leadership of Austin too, in terms of cultivating leadership in our community as well. Go ahead, Judy.
No, I was just going to say that we got an audience question in, and I'll ask that real briefly before. And I know you want to ask some economy questions, Courtney, but there's a question from Amy Everhart, and she says, in other cities, how have LGBTQIA cultural centers been created? Are they city-led or are they nonprofit? Interesting question. I don't know if you guys have a knowledge of how other cities are doing cultural centers. Queen, I know this is something near and dear to your heart. Have you studied other cities? You know what they're doing?
I studied other cities, but I wasn't it didn't struck up like a queer cultural center. There's like queer community centers, but my idea with Austin Queer Cultural Center is to embrace our culture, uplift our culture, and protect our culture. Right now, it is nonprofit, but I am leaning and leading towards the city to back us up to create jobs for the LGBT community here in Austin. I really know that when I lived in LA, there was an LGBT community center there that was open 24 hours. And I was in a distressed panic need one time at 4 o'clock in the morning, and I was able to locate it and go there for help. And I realized that being here in Austin, the city, we don't offer that. So I put forth my energies like, you know what? I'm going to create that here. If this has got to be the first rock to throw at the glass ceiling to break it down to rebuild this, that's what it's gonna have to be. But to answer that question that way, I'm not familiar how other cities do it. I just know where I lived before and seen how that community has worked with that culture and embedded that culture and protected that culture. And so I really am asking and lending the city to back us up, to know the city to know that, hey, we're here and we need our space.
Got it. Everybody needs their space, right?
Yes.
I just want to add, right, so before this, I used to be on the LGBTQ Quality of Life Advisory Commission for the city, and we looked into this, and there's a mix of models from around the country. But I think we were really excited about a public space, partially because we were looking at our peer, quality of life commissions and our other marginalized communities here in Austin, right? So the Asian American Resource Center, the African American Cultural and Genealogy Center, the Mexican American Culture Center, these are all city spaces with city employees who run them. And I think I would have definitely pushed for a model like that because it speaks to sort of community ownership, right? Through our city government, through our elected leaders, we get to own it as people, not an organization as amazing work that an organization might be doing. So I think just having that public space speaks to the values of an Austinite as well.
So I have another question that I would like to ask. Queen, you've mentioned employment and economic stability. And so Austin has passed an employment ordinance protecting people from discrimination based on gender identity and sexual orientation, but this doesn't guarantee a positive and inclusive workplace experience. So what are some of the structural barriers to employment faced by LGBTQIA plus communities? And what else must be done to ensure safe, equitable workplace environments in our region? Because we can create the jobs, but then if the safety isn't there, what's the point, you know? That's a Queen. I see you, Queen. You want to speak to that?
I just know from my personal experience with working and trying to seek employment, this is really tough to say. I know I would go to interviews as a male, dressed in male clothing, and present myself to them as a male. And just for that fear and safety, you know, to have employment, to provide for myself, and come home and, you know, put her on, be free with her. But at the same time, I know I end up losing my job. I remember my manager was saying, "You're not the person who I hired," when I never presented myself, my true self, to them. And this is like couple years ago, but now there's laws that's protecting us from that, which I wish I would have had. But like you said, we do need that safety. Again, hire more people in the LGBT community, put them in those places, you know, more than just saying it. So therefore it is seen and is known and it's respected. You know, a lot of organizations, a lot of employment people can, you know, they have that rule there, but are they going to respect it? You know, I often would hear Snickers, he, she in the background at work. And, you know, that's not cool. And it falls into being protected at work as well.
Right. And creating those spaces, not just as like a diversity role or a tokenized role, because that's dangerous too. And you might as well not even have it. So I hear you on that. Avez or Sarah, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I'll say, so I think I would agree with everything Queen just said, right? Like having those spaces is so important, but I'm also going to break it into two sort of pieces, right? Like one is really diversity inclusion and having an inclusive environment in your organization. I think that's really important. And that's what Queen is speaking to, right? Like whether that's going through having your leadership and managers trained, making sure that the space is truly affirming, making sure that there's, you know, consequences for not following those sort of organization rules. The other one is also, I want to say, hard benefits, right? There's a big conversation around whether your spouse can get healthcare and insurance through you. And also going beyond that, right? We've had this conversation for a long time where gay marriage was really hard. And if you tie marriage to any kind of benefits for your spouse, can we have +1 benefits? Can I say that this person is my person and I want them on my benefits, right? It's a different conversation. So really in terms of also the services and the support that we provide all employees, we have to make sure that they're provided to queer employees, but also in a way that suits the way they think of their family, they think of their lives, they think of their community.
Sarah, are you good? Okay.
I want to narrow the focus a little bit when it comes to employment now and talk about entrepreneurship and small businesses, because we have so many of those in Austin. The greater Austin region has home to many vibrant LGBTQIA+ businesses, small businesses, and entrepreneurs. There's a lot of work that needs to be done on an economic empowerment front, though. So what are some of the unique challenges faced by these businesses and entrepreneurs and creatives in our region? And how can we as a community as a whole better support them? Queen, I bet you have some ideas on this one.
You know, I'm an entrepreneur myself. I'm gonna be honest with you guys. With being trans and being a Black trans woman and trying to find employment, trying to make a living for myself, I have created like avenues for myself. And I've seen that in the trans community, you know, not majority of trans women, but in the start of some girls' transitions, they have to rely on sex work. No one wants to talk about that. But in a way, it gives you all the tools that you need to be successful. I'm just going to be honest with you. You learn how to plan, scheduling, money finance, all these wonderful things as if you was to work a regular job. In a way, in a sense, urge it shouldn't be like that for our community, but it is like that for our community until we create our avenues for ourselves for employment, a proper structure employment. I have a restaurant. I opened it up back in October. I closed it down, but I'm going to open it back up later in the year. I'm working on it. It would be the many first here in Austin, I think, by a Black trans woman opening and owning. But I am going to ask for everyone's support. That's how we can fix that structure. But yeah, to answer that question as well.
What kind of
yeah.
food do you serve? What's your
Seafood.
specialty? Seafood.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
Southern seafood cuisine.
Got it. Avez and Sarah, do you want to talk about some ways that we could better support small business owners like Queen?
Well, I think I'm going to start by saying once Queen, you open your restaurant, I want some of that seafood. So I will be a patron for your business, and I'm excited and looking to it. And I think, like a lot of the creatives and entrepreneurs in our, region who are struggling right now, particularly under COVID, I think we have to provide them with the support. And I want to say we have an amazing queer artist and musician and actor community. Like, it's the work that folks do is amazing. If you want to see, right? People are doing some great work. And how do we support them? And how does our city support them, making sure that they're able to sort of go through all the steps that they need to scale up the work that they're doing, also ensure that they have the services that they need to do that work, and also make it through difficult times like now, where I know not just queer entrepreneurs and artists, but most of the artists and entrepreneurs in our city are struggling. And I want to say there are some resources like our LGBTQ chamber that provide support, but we need more, and we need robust services to support those folks.
Sarah?
Yeah, I would only add that I will also be first in line for Queen's Restaurant, so I will be elbowing.
We've got several customers. We've got several customers lining up, Queen. I think it's time for our call to action, Courtney.
Yeah, so I'm gonna read out our call to action. So going forward, what are some policies either currently in committee or already in place that we as allies, advocates, and co-conspirators for our LGBTQIA+ neighbors need to know about? Which of these policies protect and empower our LGBTQIA+ communities, and which ones perpetuate harm? And I will start with Avez with that call to action.
I appreciate that. Thank you, Courtney. Again, thank you for this great conversation. I think we have to really focus on not just, talking about things that we perceive are queer issues, right? Like gay marriage or, trans folks being allowed to serve in the military. We have to go beyond that and really talk about quality of life. And quality of life, is based on all the conversation that we've had today, right? Like employment, housing, education, healthcare, public safety. These are all important. So I think really it's so important to focus on all of those policies, make sure that they're supporting and affirmative and inclusive for folks. And I also want to make just two plugs right now. One is the city of Austin is going through an LGBTQIA quality of life survey. And you can just go to shoutoutaustin.org and take that survey. So if you're somebody who is queer identifying or wants to be affirming of the people in their lives, go and complete that survey. And the other thing I would say, go and look at Equality Texas. They have calls to actions on how to get involved. We're going through a ruthless legislative session. Ricardo isn't here. I know how hard he's working, and I'm seeing my friends cry every night because they're having to go to the Capitol, talk about things, talk about who they are, and stand and face that sort of onslaught that we're facing. So I would say, as allies, folks, please step up, go to the Capitol, support the people, tell your legislators that this is something that we as Texans, all of us as Texans, will not stand up to.
Sarah.
Sure, just to build upon that, I think I have just put in the chat, sorry, it's an unwieldy link, a link to a place where you can submit written testimony for 2 of those heinous bills that are being heard today. So it's not too late to submit written testimony to make your voice heard in opposition to those 2 bills. The only other quick things I would say are a little specific to mental health and youth. Like I said before, I think really advocating for alternatives to having police address mental health crisis, which I talked about earlier, is something I think is an important call to action for our city right now. I would also like to advocate for Texas to take a look at the age of consent for mental health counseling. A lot of other states actually have lower ages. People can consent under certain circumstances at 14, 15, 16. I think that would be really helpful for our LGBTQIA community. And finally, this was a positive LGBTQIA bill that was introduced this session. It's been introduced in a lot of sessions. There is a discriminatory, what is called Romeo and Juliet law in the book on the books in Texas, in the Texas Family Code. So basically, folks who are in high school are allowed to date each other, even though there is a little bit of an age difference, but that doesn't apply to non-heterosexual couples, which is just, in my view, unconstitutional. And so hoping that that gets addressed in the Texas Family Code at some point in the near future.
Thank you, Sarah. Queen.
These two answered it very well, and I'm just speechless. Thank you guys for covering the points for me. Like I said, go out, write your testimonies, let your voice be heard. You can't just be quiet.
Thank you, Queen. And I want to bring in Ricardo's voice. So Ricardo said, today we're going to be fighting these bills. HB 1399, this bill discourages doctors from providing best practice transition care by prohibiting professional liability insurance from covering transition-related care. And then there's HB 1424. This bill would allow any medical professional to object to any medical procedure that violates their ethical, moral, or religious beliefs, even if the procedure is in question is life-saving care. And so he also encourages you to sign up for the rally that's happening today at noon, and we will share that link. Sign up to testify, submit your written testimony. And finally, he says there are 2 of 30 plus anti-LGBTQIA plus bills. Texas accounts for 30% of all anti-LGBTQIA plus bills filed this year in state legislature. And so visit Equality Texas for their bill tracker, so you can see the ones that you should be wary of.
We had such powerful calls to action today, and just an incredible panel with great perspective. We want to thank our panelists for sharing those life experiences and those wonderful perspectives with our viewers today. Thank you to Queen Austin, Aves Azer, and Sarah Kapustashi for shedding light on this issue and encouraging us and telling us about ways we can all get involved and be better supporters of the LGBTQIA plus community.
And just so you know, we'll be sharing follow-up materials to those who registered for today's discussion. So if you would like to get those resources from our guests, remember to register for the panels through Leadership Austin's website at www.leadershipaustin.org.
We want to thank everybody who watched today on Facebook. We hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as we did. We encourage you to share it with your friends. We want to invite everyone also to join us for our next Engage Breakfast, which will take place on May 12th, same time, same place. And we're going to be tackling a very timely topic, and that is how Asian Americans are experiencing their life here in Austin. What are the issues? And considering the hate and discrimination that's going on against that population right now, we feel like this is going to be a very, very important discussion. So we hope you see you in May. We appreciate you watching, and we hope that you have a wonderful day.